What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I am very late to the party on reviewing this movie, but the new Indonesian action movie, The Night Comes For Us on Netflix, is too damn good for me to pass up an opportunity to sing its praises. One of the main reasons I'm so late to the party is because I watch a lot of MMA, and so usually I get my martial arts fix just from watching actual martial arts competition. And while I grew up loving and adoring action movies and martial arts movies, but in recent years I've just found myself watching fewer of those movies because I watch MMA so much. But over the last couple days on Twitter, people kept asking me, have you seen The Night Comes For Us? Have you seen The Night Comes For Us? And I kept delaying and putting it off. And then finally, my favorite MMA analyst, Luke Thomas, he actually took a break from his commentary on the sport of MMA to do a review of this movie because the martial arts in it are so damn good. So at that point, I realized this was something I absolutely had to see. So I sat down and watched it last night, and it absolutely blew my mind. I don't know what's in the water over in Indonesia, but for the last 10 years, they've been cranking out some of the most jaw-dropping, awe-inspiring action movies ever made. The two most obvious examples would be the two Raid movies. But calling The Night Comes For Us an action movie doesn't really do it justice. Imagine a scenario where you have like 50 to 100 slasher monsters from movies like Halloween or Friday the 13th, basically a bunch of maniacs wielding pipes and hatchets and box cutters. And then imagine that army of sociopaths going up against 5 or 6 people that are basically as lethal and cunning and badass as Hugh Jackman was in the movie Logan. And I mentioned Logan specifically, not just the character of Wolverine, because that movie was very bloody. And this movie is one of the most gruesome, savage, bloody, fucked up, just gut-churning action extravaganzas you are likely to see anytime soon. And what I loved in particular about this movie is that the filmmaking technique employed in capturing the action is incorporated into the martial arts choreography. I feel like there's a loathsome tendency in American action movies where either through rapid-fire cutting or through shaky cam, you try to cut around the action in a way where you basically disguise the fact that the action on display is not particularly good. But this movie has this enormous bag of tricks for getting the camera right in on the action, whether it's by attaching the camera to a hand that's wielding a nasty blade, or by having the camera move and follow the action as people are being thrown over shoulders or falling over tables, or just mounting a camera behind somebody's head so you're basically in the driver's seat watching the action like a first-person experience. It was just a beautiful, ruthless reminder about what martial arts and movies is all about. And I'm embarrassed to admit that I'm largely unfamiliar with the work of this director. His name is Timo Tjahjanto, if I'm saying that correctly. He both wrote and directed the movie, as well as adapting it into a graphic novel before he turned it into a film. And it should also be mentioned that this is the first Indonesian movie produced by Netflix. That said, it's almost impossible to watch in Indonesia because the largest internet and network provider in that country of Indonesia has banned and blocked Netflix from their service. But if you've seen the two Raid movies, you'll recognize a lot of the stars in this movie. The main central character, Joe Taslim, he was in the first Raid movie. His best friend slash adversary in this is played by Iko Uwais, who was in both the Raid movies, and we're starting to see him appear in a lot of Hollywood movies as well. And we also had the very beautiful but very lethal Julie Estelle, who people will remember as the Hammer Girl from Raid 2. But as badass as these 3 actors are in this movie, what's cool about this flick is that it has an enormous supporting cast of smaller characters who are all equally lethal and dynamic and compelling in their own right, and all have these amazing scenes and hero beats. But the premise of the movie is pretty simple. It's about the triads, which are at the height of their power, and they control roughly 80% of the gun running and the drug trafficking and the human trafficking that goes on in Southeast Asia. But within the triads, you have these elite delegates that are basically responsible for maintaining order and making sure that business proceeds as usual. And these delegates are always changing, what they're known as the 6 C's. They're basically superhuman assassins who are phenomenal at martial arts and great with all manner of weapons. But where the drama of this movie picks up is when Ito, played by Joe Taslim, decides enough's enough. When the triads find out that there are a few thieves in a village that are stealing from them, their solution is just to destroy the entire village. And as Ito is watching this massacre take place around him, he has a change of heart because there's a little girl who's just watched her parents murdered in front of her, and Ito just snaps and he murders all of his allies. He takes the girl into protective custody, and he basically decides that he's going to do whatever he can in his power to protect her, as well as taking down a lot of his former friends and allies. And as he basically goes into hiding trying to protect this girl, waves upon waves of criminals are sent after him, trying to kill both him and the little girl. And the great curveball is that Ito's closest friend, Arian, who also works for the Triads, who's been away for years in Macau running a nightclub, he's called back to deal with the problem. The big question for Arian is, will he remember his loyalty to his friend, or will he do as his employers tell him to do? And it leads to this great dynamic where you can tell that Ito and Arian still remain very close, and on frequent occasions throughout the movie try to protect one another, but at the same time, it's inevitable, it's their fate that they're on a collision course, and eventually they're going to have to scrap. But it's one of those scenarios shows like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, where you can tell they're postponing that inevitable confrontation as long as humanly possible. But along the way, the movie features probably 10 to 15 major action set pieces that are some of the most astonishing things you will ever see in your life. And to be fair, because I don't want to overpraise the movie, in between some of these action scenes, occasionally the movie is a little slow, but it's basically, the movie has a very stripped down, bare bones, almost Spartan style. And the movie can get very quiet and very subdued, but it's basically the calm before the storm. And when these storms begin, you basically have to hold on to your chair because the brutality of the sequences can almost be a little overwhelming at times. And eventually, the only sane response is just to cackle wildly like a hyena because you see so much death and so much destruction and so many people roaring in pain. You almost enter a delirious state where you feel like you're going insane and you have no choice but to laugh because what you're seeing is just so completely insane. And what's great is how the action over the course of the movie builds to a crescendo, because initially at the beginning of the movie, the action is cool, but it's not yet grotesque. You'll see some brilliant scenes where you're like, all right, this is a good action movie. But what you don't know at the time is that they're just going to keep raising the stakes over and over and over again, and the intensity and the brutality of the action scenes is going to continue to rise until you get to the climax of the movie where it's just completely awe-inspiring. And as I mentioned before, what makes this movie great is the extensive supporting cast, because this is not a movie where you just have two badasses and a bunch of disposable goons who they're basically going to mow their way through on a collision course toward one another. The character Ito has this great circle of friends, in particular Fatty and White Boy Bobby. And watching these two guys give their all trying to save the life of this young girl is by far one of the best parts of the movie, because you basically have a couple friends in this apartment and an army of hatchet-wielding goons trying to get inside. But because there's only one doorway, you basically have a bottleneck. So that as this army is trying to pour in, these two psychopaths are taking them on one at a time. And what I love is how it borrows from the Hong Kong tradition, in particular the John Woo movies of the late 80s, where no matter how many times you get stabbed, no matter how many times you get shot, the wounds will never be fatal until it's used to the maximum dramatic effect. So you have these characters where they've been stabbed by hatchets and box cutters and screwdrivers, sometimes hundreds of times, and they'll get subdued and they'll have blood dripping out of their mouth and they look like they're about spent, and suddenly they'll just kind of roar in defiance and they'll rise back up, and it's almost like their injuries have completely disappeared and they're able to start all over again. A perfect example is the main character Ito, who's in like 6 or 7 battles where he basically by the end of the battle is taken to death's door, but all those injuries are conveniently forgotten or healed by the time he gets to the next big encounter. But while Bobby and Fatty are trying to protect this girl, we're introduced to two of the best villains in the movie. Because amidst the army of all these crazy assassins, you also have these super assassins, and usually they have a really specific gimmick that sets them apart. You have these two girls, one's white, one's Asian, and it suggests that they're a couple. And the white girl has these really crazy, eerie looking eyes, but her weapon of choice is this giant like curved knife / hatchet, and we get this one beautiful sequence where all in one take, and you see her just taking on one guy after another, and she basically kills 3 guys in a row without a cut. It's just wonderful, beautiful stuff to watch in action. But her Asian lover has this strange gimmick. It's basically like a yo-yo with razor wire, and in combat she swings it around and she'll basically rip people's hands off or rip people's throats open. But after watching these two girls murder countless people over the course of the movie, we get this brilliant confrontation between the two of them and the operator. And the operator is played by Julia Estelle, and Julia Estelle played the Hammer Girl in Raid 2. And she's equally badass in her own right, if not more so. When we first get introduced to her, you basically have an army of goons looking into the smoke, and through that smoke you just see this red beam coming out, and the red beam is a laser sight, and she just starts taking people out one after another. But we see how badass she is in hand-to-hand combat as well, because she and Ito, even though they eventually become allies, they do scrap in an apartment at one point, and it's one of the most badass fight scenes of the movie. In any case, when the operator takes on these two special assassins, it's one of the absolute high points of the movie, and this is where it gets particularly gruesome. At one point, the operator gets an injury that's pretty bad, and she looks down and sees that her finger is partially severed, and she ends up just yanking it off and throwing it aside, because as we see, her opponent has already been disemboweled and doesn't even know it yet. People who have weak stomachs will probably turn off the movie at that point, but I just couldn't believe the level of brutality I was seeing between these astonishingly beautiful, lethal assassins. And watching the choreography in the movie, it makes you realize just how many American action movies are just absolutely standing still, because the sequences blend together almost like this elaborate lethal dance. But they also have an exquisite attention to detail and this incredible creativity and imagination. A perfect example would be a fight between Ito and a bunch of butchers in a slaughterhouse. And at one point, he's using this giant bone to fight them. And as he's whacking these guys with the bone, two guys team up on him, and they're basically trying to saw him in half with this giant buzzsaw, and he's using the bone to defend himself. But he creates a quick distraction where he sends the buzzsaw from one guy's hand into the other guy's leg, and he ends up snapping the bone in two, and then taking the bone, shoving it through one guy's face and through another guy's chest. And it's this perfect exclamation mark for ending the scene. But it's a situation where just in one scene, you'll have so many little interesting beats and details and moments where you basically have to watch anywhere from 50 to 100 American action movies before you'd have an equal number of equally exciting beats. And as I mentioned before, this movie keeps building and building and building, and eventually Ito and Arian have to go head to head. And this movie might set a new record for the total number of stabbings in a single fight scene. I mean, they're stabbing each other with box cutters, they're stabbing each other with screwdrivers, they're stabbing each other with everything they get their hands on. And once again, all it takes is just like a bestial roar, and they're able just to plow right through it and keep fighting. And what's insane is how the fight basically draws to a close where they've both impaled each other, and the camera slowly drifts around, and we see that Ito has a box cutter going through his cheek and out the other side of his face, and Arian basically has a knife up in his throat that's about to sever his windpipe, and they're just locked in this deadly embrace. But even after the action of the movie is basically finished, the director's not content to allow this movie to go out on a whimper. He demands that it goes out on a bang, and we have an almost orgasmic final shot where Ito's in a car, there's an army of villains with machine guns, they're all arrayed, they're ready to take him out, and he just drives toward them as fast as he can, just roaring in defiance. And the movie cuts to black and the credits, and that's the end of the flick, and it's the perfect way to bring this movie to a close. So suffice to say, I was blown away by this movie. This movie is not for everybody, because a lot of people will be confused by the fact that you essentially have an action movie or a martial arts movie with a level of gore and violence that exceeds that of most horror movies. But I think if people are willing to give it a chance, they might see just how boring and mundane and conventional so many of our own American action movies are. Honestly, we need movies like this every once in a while that can remind us of what the heights of the action genre truly can be. And as so many of our American action movies veer into PG-13 territory because the conventional wisdom is that unless you go PG-13, you're not going to be able to get families in. It's not going to be able to compete in the global marketplace. And I love how Netflix is like, you know what? Screw all that. We've got 130 million subscribers. Some of them are going to be into this. And I feel like this is this classic example where it's directly targeting a niche audience of people who like insanely aggressive, insanely intense action movies with extraordinary martial arts, extraordinary choreography, brilliant filmmaking technique, a level of gore that puts most horror movies to shame. And my hope is that it'll continue to stimulate an appetite for these kind of movies, and that we'll get to see more of them on Netflix in the future. Because at this point, in terms of just sheer size and scope and reach, Netflix's only real competitor is Disney. But obviously, Disney's in the business of Pixar and Marvel and Star Wars. You're just not going to see that kind of action coming out of Disney. And I love how Netflix is perfectly willing to offer the kind of entertainment that Disney would never touch. So in the meantime, I need to watch some more movies by this director. His two most recent movies were May the Devil Take You and Headshot. I'd seen a short film by him in VHS 2 and another short by him in the ABCs of Death, but I'm basically new to his work. But I'm incredibly curious to see what the rest of his filmography might have to offer, and I'll definitely be first in line for any movies that he makes in the future. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this rant, because it wasn't really a review, it's more of a rant. But a movie as exciting and thrilling as this one, I feel like a caffeine-fueled rant is the only sane response. But if you enjoyed this review, please consider subscribing to my channel. If you want to talk about action movies or whatever, you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax. That is the best place to reach me, or you can leave a comment in the comments below. But thanks so much for watching my channel. I really appreciate it, and I'll be back at you in the very near future. Onwards and upwards.